When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of three, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. You know, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib, in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read, in perfect contentment, for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said, more clearly this time. "Did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." Knocking on window? I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought. But being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy, in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still, my heart thumped in my chest. This is silly, I told myself. Be a man. I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars Battlefront's game pause screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperated, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore that size. Of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone brightly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. No, shh, I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move." I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones, so I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man, standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before. But he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest, and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11. Forever 11. Never growing up. Frozen in time, in the memories of all who once knew him, as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared transfixed as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy. Beyond happy. Elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed, loudly, in pain, as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. No more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it, was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then, I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well, in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe the hutch. "He's here!" the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky, gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the toilet," I snarled at him. He began to wail in pain and surprise. but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once, he almost slipped back down. Almost. But he was stronger than I thought he was and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold," screamed Georgie as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks, not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light, off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life. But that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight I could see, Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds, maybe, and finally reached the Garland's front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat, drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in. This happened to me when I was 13 years old, during the summer break of 8th grade. I am now 15. One summer morning, I decided to go get some sushi for my sisters and I from a restaurant which is roughly 1 kilometer from our house. I went alone and walked to the restaurant, got the food, and began walking back. At the time, I had just been reintroduced to makeup and was experimenting with eyeliner. On that specific day, I applied some very thick and bold eyeliner for fun, expecting to receive a few glances here and there. As I exited through the restaurant's parking lot, I walked past a tall man who appeared to be in his late 20s. He stared at me the entire time we walked in each other's direction. He was walking towards the restaurant, and I away. I didn't think much of it because I had just assumed he noticed my flashy eyeliner, and this was something I had expected at the time. Upon passing him, I continued making my way home and jaywalked across the road. As I did this, I noticed that to my left a car stopped to allow for another person behind me to jaywalk themselves. I looked around to see that it was the same man from earlier. But wasn't he going the other way? I thought. I stepped onto the sidewalk and began walking home at a fast pace. I sensed the man's footsteps behind me quickening as he talked to someone on the phone, suspiciously loudly. I clearly heard him say over the phone something along the lines of, "I am coming there. I will be there in 5 minutes," as if he wanted me to know that he had somewhere to be. His walking speed gradually became jogging, and out of fear I looked behind me as he stopped right beside me and asked, "Tu parles espagnol?" I had an idea that he was asking me if I spoke Spanish, and I hesitantly said, "No." For reference, I'm brown, but not Hispanic, which is probably why he decided to begin with asking that. To get to my house, I took a shortcut which is more of a secluded path across a park, as I normally do. Now that I think of it, specifically in that situation, I shouldn't have taken that path, considering this creep was walking by my side. I was quite naive back then, and I didn't think much of the situation. This man continued to walk by my side and continued to make conversation with me, talking about geography and his family heritage, while also asking me questions about myself. Where are you from? How many siblings do you have? What are your favorite subjects? I went along with everything he said and also added on to the conversation. I think that due to being so nervous, I just went along with it, because I just didn't know what else to do. Now, of course, I wouldn't entertain his conversation and would say I'm in a rush. At this point, we reach a fork in the path. I took the right path, hoping this man would take the left one, but to my surprise, he followed my turn. Now as we continued walking, we entered a more secluded patch of grass. I distinctly remember what he told me specifically at that spot, which began to ring all the alarms in my head, telling me this man was not normal. I should have realized that long before. He said something like, "You know, you are very smart for a girl your age. You are not like the other girls." That's when I realized I needed to do something to get out of the situation immediately. Up ahead, I saw another intersection which led to the opposite path from earlier. I then asked him, "Which way are you going from here?" He then says, "Oh, I was supposed to take the opposite path from earlier, but I liked talking to you so much I took the same path as you so we could talk longer." At that moment, I felt a mix of fear and disgust. As we near the upcoming intersection, he then says, "Well, I guess I do have to go this way now. Do you have your phone with you so we could switch numbers? I really enjoyed talking to you." Now note, the entire way I was clearly uncomfortable, and he was the only one talking, with my mumbling a few responses here and there. I told him, I don't feel comfortable doing that. We just met and talked for a few minutes." He then starts pushing it and gets visibly annoyed. "Come on, do you have any social media? Instagram? Snapchat? Let's switch. I would love to meet you again." He came off as aggressive, and I began fearing for my life. "No, my parents wouldn't want me doing that. Sorry about that." He then backs up and says, "I respect your decision. Again, it was great meeting you," and then leaves. You can clearly tell that this man was not normal and that he probably didn't have good intentions approaching a young girl who was alone. I am lucky that he decided to eventually leave, and looking back at the encounter, I wish I hadn't done what I did and stayed in the more public zone. This goes to the creep I met that day. Let's not meet again. I recently moved to Florida from Pennsylvania for a job. All of my family and friends are still in Pennsylvania, so I live by myself here, which can get pretty spooky. My second week here, I met my next-door neighbor, Eddie. He seemed like a relatively normal guy in his 70s, very quiet and polite. One day, they turned the water off in the whole complex for repairs without notice, and I went over to ask if his was off too. He answered the door and proceeded to talk to me for about a half hour. I obliged because I hadn't seen him get any visitors and I'd assumed he was lonely. Toward the end of the conversation, it started to get creepy. He said that he was on his balcony one day, watching the neighbor girl across the way through her window as she took bikini pics. He then said, "If I had daughters, I'd be constantly scared that they're doing that. You don't scare your dad like that, do you?" It put a bad taste in my mouth, but I just attributed it to his loneliness. A few days later, a looming shadow appeared in front of me, and I saw him briefly looking in my window. To my knowledge, he only has an ex-wife. No kids, no partner, and no family to my knowledge. Fast forward a few weekends, my partner came to visit me, and we were out all day at the flea market. I came back to a note in my door from him saying I'd had a package delivered and he'd picked it up for me. My partner, Scott, went to the bathroom and I went next door to pick up my package. I knocked and there was no answer. Later, he came to my door in the shortest robe ever and said he'd been in the shower. I said, "Oh, okay, thanks for picking up my package." And before I could close the door, he'd mentioned that we didn't need to be quiet and to let us know if he was making too much noise. Fast forward 2-ish weeks when I get home from work. The people from my apartment's office were up on my landing in front of my door, which I'd assumed was for the palmetto bug I reported, but I didn't understand why it took all 3 of them. I walked up the stairs and they asked me when the last time I'd seen Eddie was. I told them about the encounter 2 weeks prior. I entered my apartment. A few minutes later, they knocked on my door and asked me if the man on this scan of an ID was my neighbor, to which I confirmed. After that, I went to the 7-Eleven to pick up some ice, and when I'd returned, there were 2 police cars in the parking lot. I approached the stairs, and everyone on the landing was looking at me. When I got up the stairs, the officer asked me when the last time I'd seen Eddie was. I reiterated my previous answer. I went back in my apartment and started my nightly cleaning. Around 10 minutes later, a different cop knocked and asked me the same question, to which I obliged. I was the last person to report seeing him. While the officer was asking me questions, the apartment office staff were talking to another cop and they said, "Oh, he's in there and all melty." My neighbor died. Apparently, it is likely that it was a week or two ago because he'd been so decomposed he leaked into the apartment downstairs. He must not have had anyone to check on him in that time. That's now one of my worst fears. I also feel bad for not checking on him because I hadn't seen him in a while, but I just attributed it to opposite schedules as I work a Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. The creepiest part is I've been hearing sounds from that apartment, knocking, as if someone was living there. Also found out that this is likely the root of my bedroom palmetto bug problem, since I'm particular about keeping my apartment clean. I've slept on my couch the past week. It's hard living here alone at night now. They also left the examiner gloves on the landing, which I'm pretty sure is a biohazard. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you ever had a creepy encounter? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. If you have any stories you'd like to be narrated, be sure to send them in. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fearseekers. I'll see you in the next video.
He's not dead.